Good day, AASG members, associates, honorary members, and other federal or public who are reviewing this presentation. For all of you, we'd just like to present a better understanding of the National Geologic Mapping Act of 1992. NGMA represents a continuing collaboration between AASG and USGS and dating back to the 1980s and how we are where we are today. We are very pleased with the fact that we are increased funding and we have many more collaboration efforts with our USGS partners. In 2016, a drafting of a decadal plan began for the NCGMP for the next 10 years. But now we're looking at new funding and programs that were never adequately funded in the past, and there will be a decadal workshop scheduled now for April of 2021. This presentation was prepared by Dr. Richard Berg with the assistance of John Price and input from the AASG, ESCOM, and USGS. Dr. Berg has done an excellent job of compiling the history in short notes and anecdotes by John Price, and we can share these with all of you about the AASG history also from Jim Cobb. Lastly, in 2021, over 50% of the state geologists have been in their positions for less than 7 years. This includes all of the current ExCom committee. So this will be a YouTube video for all to learn about the history of the National Geologic Mapping Act, the NCGMP, going forward. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, John. National Geologic Mapping Act of 1992. Imagine a federal law written specifically for geological mapping. When we look back almost 30 years, it's quite a remarkable feat for a topic that's considered by many to be pretty mundane topic. But obviously at the forefront of what folks at the USGS and AASG were thinking is being foundational to economic development, resource potential in the United States. So how did we get there? And then what are some of the precepts of the Act? And then a number of reflections on the Act. But first, a preamble, a prehistory of the National Geologic Mapping Act. You know, where did it all begin? And really it was about 50, 60 years ago where state geological surveys they had made the observation that geological research was really shifting away from sort of societally driven things to more fundamental research. That bothered them. And this was really at the same time that the environmental movement was beginning. My next slide will show that very clearly. And then in order to satisfy the laws and regulations of these new environmental initiatives, geological information was necessary. But let's just fast forward a little bit to 1982. There was a meeting held at the Illinois State Geological Survey, and state geologists were concerned about what they considered a national crisis for collecting, preserving, and publishing basic geological information. They unanimously agreed that these topics were crucial to both the states and the nation, and agreed that it was going to be a top priority by both levels of government. And here's what was going on during that time. Just look at the period from 1970 to 1990. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, pretty much Clear Everything Act, as this environmental movement was sweeping through the nation. I know here in Illinois, Illinois Groundwater Protection Act was developed. Everything that was being done congruously between the states and between the federal government. So there was a real need to conduct, geological mapping in support of these laws and regulations. 1983-84, AASG was in a lot of discussions with USGS looking at, perhaps a comprehensive national geological mapping program. Something that maybe could be patterned after the water resources cooperative that the USGS had, where there was a 50-50 match by states. In April of '84, the COGEOMAP program was born. This was really the precursor for NCGMP, and that it would be introduced as a line item. And 7 months later, it was indeed authorized, and $22,000 was allocated to 18 states. I remember Illinois being a recipient of that, and personally, I was taking a responsibility for it here in Illinois. And this, as I said, marked the beginning of that state-federal partnership. And this program, continued into the 80s, but it was always considered to be too small to really make any difference, and that states would have to be mapping for decades to even come up to minimum standards of what was actually required. In June '85, there was a forum looking at this. And as a result, there was a resolution that endorsed COGEOMAP and urged the USGS to increase its funding. At the same time, the USGS designated a couple line items and programs, but COGEOMAP was near level funded. In October of that year, there was a committee composed of the USGS along with some AASG members who held discussions again with the USGS to express some of the concerns on the low funding. But during a 1986 annual meeting of the AASG, there was a USGS commitment to increase funding, and the proposal was to fund mapping directly through university geology departments. And my note on that is that you can well imagine that this did not go over very well by AASG members. Fast forward to 1987, when things really started moving very quickly. There was a National Geologic Mapping Act of 1987. I don't have a whole lot of information on that, but it was presented to Congress. There was testimony that was given, but little response came from that testimony. There was also a survey sent out to all the states, and that survey's results were provided at the June 1987 AASG annual meeting, where it proposed the USGS National Mapping Program and also included COGEOMAP as an element of that. Another resolution was passed, including language supporting geological mapping. A lot of us know AASG President Chip Grote stating that a National Geologic Mapping Program was incredibly significant from both a national and a state perspective. A committee was charged with formulating strategies to develop that plan. And in '88, it was recommended that a position paper, pursue that legislative route, and the drafts be prepared and circulated to AASG members. '88, there were more committees that were formed, moving forward with a National Geologic Mapping Initiative to develop a position paper, basically a layman's language position paper to promote to Congress, executive branches, and the public, and also to begin the process of drafting legislation to establish that geologic mapping program by statute. And that 1987 National Geologic Mapping Act was used as a template. In the late fall and summer of '89, there was an AASG implementation committee that developed plans for this authorized national mapping program, began drafting and introducing the legislation, looking at the COGEOMAP program as a potential source. During a geological mapping forum, USGS stressed the COGEOMAP program be retained while also pursuing the new mapping initiative. And October 29th, 1990 was really a sort of a banner date as AASG actually approved to move ahead with the draft implementation plan and to begin drafting authorization language. And that whole period, 1990 to 1992, was incredibly active as AASG interacted on a regular basis with their counterparts at the USGS as well as with congressional members and staff. In June of '91, both a Senate bill and a House bill were introduced. On July 20th and 25th, respectively, initial hearings were held on both bills with 6 state geologists providing testimony, and you're going to hear from one of them in just a moment, John Price. In May of '92, the bill passed unanimously by both houses. On May 18th, it was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush. And some reflections here I think are quite significant, made by Bob Feckendenny, the then state geologist of New York, stating that it was an unusual law. It was sponsored and supported by both political parties. Secondly, it went through Congress very quickly as it became law in the same session as it was introduced. It was co-sponsored by a lot of senators, almost half the Senate, and a lot of representatives. And it would improve the nation's wealth, health, and well-being at a positive benefit cost ratio. And you're going to see this come full circle at the end of this presentation, where we actually get back to the benefit cost investigations that were done in support of this. So the bottom line here is that there were real drivers for the National Geologic Mapping Act. There were new laws and regulations, and the geological information that would be provided through mapping was needed to address them. And then I think at the same time, we did have the right people in the right places at the right time to facilitate action. And one of the right people at the right time, at the right place was Jonathan Price, the then director of the Nevada survey, and John is going to be providing some perspectives on the process. John?
Thanks, Dick. Yeah, I was on the implementation committee that Charlie Mankin set up in 1989 and testified on the bill before it was passed. A few points that I'd like to make. One was that Dallas Peck was the director of the USGS at the time that we were working on the bill and when it passed. And there were several folks within the sort of mid-level management of the USGS who really tried to keep us from passing the bill. They felt like the USGS already had the authority to carry forward with geologic mapping across the country, and that a separate bill wasn't needed. But Dallas was on our side, and as the director of the USGS, he kept us on track and helped to keep those managers focused on working with AASG to create a good bill. Another point that I'd like to make is that in 1994, in the midterm elections, the House leadership went over to the Republican side, and there was a proposal to eliminate the USGS. Several other agencies, including the U.S. Bureau of Mines, were proposed as well. The Bureau of Mines did not survive. Pieces of it went to other agencies, but the USGS did survive. And one of the reasons why the USGS did survive was AASG. The director of the USGS at that time, Gordon Eaton, came to us and asked for our support of the USGS, which was indeed provided. Don Hoskins was the president of AASG at the time. He was the state geologist of Pennsylvania. And Don worked with Gordy Eaton to come up with a new funding approach for the National Cooperative Geologic Mapping Act. And that was when we saw an increase, a significant increase from about $1 million to about $4 million a year going to the state map component of the bill. So those are a couple of perspectives that I have about the program. We did ask for and insist upon accountability annually for the products from state map. That meant there had to be deliverables. They could be open file maps, but there had to be some proof that the mapping was going forward on an annual basis, or the state wouldn't get funding in the next year. That was something that everybody agreed was a worthwhile thing to have. And I believe that resulted in a very impressive amount of new mapping throughout the country. Many of those maps later went through peer review and came out as fully published maps, although some of them continued as just open file maps. We asked for similar accountability on the FedMap side, but there was a bit more bureaucracy there. And as a result, the level of productivity on the FedMap side wasn't as much as we saw on the state map. Another thing that we insisted in the legislation was a limit on overhead, the indirect costs that are charged to the program, and we called for that both on the state map side and on what the USGS charged to the state map side for their overhead in running the state map part. So those were all key parts of how the program went forward. At the time, we stressed that the funding for state maps should go into new geologic maps as opposed to derivative maps. But now with more funding in the program, I think there's a clear need to look again at how broad the definition of geologic maps is. So with that, Dick, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Okay, so now what we're going to do is go through the act section by section, starting with section 1, working through section 9, and just a few ground rules here of what you're going to see. The wording that's up here is extracted exactly as it was published as 1992 Geological Mapping Act. The slides like this first one you see with the yellow headings They contain, like I mentioned, the exact 1982 language. And then some slides will contain major reauthorization updates. We know that there were reauthorizations in 97, 99, 2009, and 2019, and those will be shown by different colors. You'll also see some slides with white headings and blue background. They also contain original language, and they also contain colored reauthorization updates, but they also show what was the compliance with the act? How is the USGS and state geological surveys complied with the actual various sections of the act? And there's also a few other comments as well. The underlines and yellow highlights throughout these slides just mainly reflect emphases by myself. So section 2, findings and purpose. The most significant findings are that the fact that geologic maps are the primary data for virtually all applied and basic earth science investigations. And you can see this list A through J it's as much relevant now as it was in 1987. It talks about site characterization, environmental protection, infrastructure requirements, which is bobbing its head up right now, coastal and stream erosion. And as we move forward to 2009 reauthorization, they added a couple to the list, recreation and public awareness. And a couple comments on some of these findings and this list. I think if we wanted to update it for the next reauthorization, which would be 2023, we might add aggregate and critical minerals, green technology contributions, geothermal, groundwater discharge, habit sustainability, restoration, and oceans in our Great Lakes, and also contamination potential assessments. We can tackle that job when the time comes. Additional findings. Again, strongly stated that federal agencies, state, local governments determine the extent of potential environmental damage at places before they occur. You can do so by looking at geological maps, by geological information. But two of the most significant ones here, John mentioned this, a finding was the states are willing to contribute 50% of the funding necessary to complete the mapping. So here's where the 50% match came from. Then the last one, which is really a statement on program outcome and expectations to achieve, and it's a very critical statement. The finding is that it is a comprehensive nationwide program of geological mapping, and in 1999, they added of superficial and bedrock deposits is required in order to systematically build the nation's geologic map database at a pace that responds to increasing demand. Incredibly important statement. The purpose of the act is very straightforward, very simple, to expedite the production of a geologic map database, and that database be located within the USGS. A lot of words. All that really happened here in 1997 is that they moved some provisions from findings to purpose, but the same wording. But I include this just to make this presentation complete. Section 3, definitions, a whole bunch of definitions. Some definitions added in 97 and 99, particularly in 99, educational, federal, and state components. Section 4, the Geological Mapping Program, establishing something called the National Cooperative Geological Mapping Program. And then in 1997, really emphasized the point that there is established a National Cooperative Geological Mapping Program between the USGS and the state geological surveys acting through the association, which is AASG, with specific responsibilities now of the USGS. The USGS is a lead agency to develop a program implementation plan and also have an advisory committee. Very specific responsibilities. Also, that the USGS was to submit a report to Congress saying, what progress they were making, but a couple significant additions in the 1997 reauthorization is how the USGS and the association will coordinate the development and implementation of the plan, and how the USGS and the association will establish goals, mapping priorities, and target dates for implementation. And this all included long-term staffing plans. And then this last clause at the end for it was deleted. It refers to using commercially available aerial photography, geodesy, etc. That was deleted. The Geological Mapping Program also includes under USGS responsibilities that they shall do in cooperation, again, with state geological surveys, the Geological Map Database, and maps and mapping standards. So how was Section 42A addressed? Well, in 1996, you can well imagine there was a big push by the USGS to implement the Act or continue implementing the Act and develop the Geologic Map Database in cooperation with AASG. A year later, 1997, it experienced its first digital mapping techniques workshop that Dave Soller organized and is still doing. And there were several committees formed to pursue the various activities. And if we look today at what's going on, the NGMDB's multi-phase approach was developed. It's operational. It continues to meet, the mandates of the 1992 Act and has expanded. Program objectives, pretty simple. Determine the nation's geologic framework and such maps to be contributed to the National Geologic Map Database. Also to develop ancillary databases. You're talking about geochemistry, geochronology, paleontology. You're talking about providing value-added descriptive and interpretive information to the Geologic Map Database. Also talked about applying cost-effective mapping techniques and having a program of public awareness. Program components, which we're all quite familiar with. First being the federal geologic mapping component, national requirements in areas of multiple issue need or areas of a compelling single issue need, all solving critical earth science problems. Then we had the second component. It's called the mapping support component, known informally as support map. Again, this mentions the National Geologic Map Database, cost-effective digital methods, but this goes into the 4 databases: paleontology, geochronology / isotopic investigations, geophysics, and geochemistry. And this went through several reorganizations and in various reauthorizations. In 1999, they replaced the words mapping support component with interdisciplinary studies. And then finally in 2009, deleted geophysical and geochemical database components, but they retained paleontologic, geochronologic, and isotopic studies as needed investigations that support mapping. So how was this last section addressed? Well, again, it established the National Geologic Map Database and implemented, cost-effective digital methods through DMT meetings. It recognized paleontology, geochronology, and isotopic studies as federal research components that supports mapping. And it also established FedMap as not just geological mapping, but also the science that supports it. And that's incredibly important, both for the states and for the federal government. But it specifically mentions FedMap. Recognizes information for characterizing units, and we know that that's important for potential derivative products. And as it relates to developing seamless national 3D, there's really renewed emphasis here as these being the studies that are really required to help characterize those materials that would then go into that 3D seamless information. And then our all too familiar state geological mapping component, where priorities determined by an advisory committee integrated with national priorities. The education component to develop academic programs that teach earth science students, provide broad education for mapping and field activities, and integrated with other mapping components. A lot of words on this page. 1999 reauthorization emphasized really 2 things. Really emphasized that integration of federal and state priorities. And then secondly was the use of the funds. And here's where the 18% came from. Recipients of grants under the state and educational component should not use more than 15.25% of federal funds for indirect costs and other issues, other charges. How was this addressed? The USGS did clarify that indirect charges apply only to direct cost items allowable under a negotiated cost rate agreement. In other words, the 15.25% was equal to the 18% of total direct costs. That's where the 18% came from. We know that advisory committees formed in all states. They've been operational since program inception, and they advise on new mapping. It says nothing about compilations. We know that national and state alignment is becoming more important. And we also know that the 3 main components of state map, FedMap, and EdMap efforts are coordinating and doing so quite well. And then going back, I think, to this original finding here in section 2, again, calls for what defines really what new mapping is. Comprehensive nationwide program of mapping of superficial and bedrock deposits to build the nation's geologic map database. Section 5 is the Federal Advisory Committee, originally established to have 16 members and full representatives from state geological surveys, duties, primarily to review the scientific progress of the program, submit an annual report. A couple of maturations with reauthorizations. Advisory committee reduced from 16 to 10 in the 97 reauthorization, reducing from 4 to 2 representatives from state geological surveys, and in 2009, increasing it by 1, adding a member from private industry. How was Section 5 addressed? Well, we do have a congressionally mandated National Cooperative Geological Mapping Federal Advisory Committee. It was established, it's operational. And the National Geologic and Geophysical Data Preservation Program is also placed under this Federal Advisory Committee. Section 6 is the implementation plan, and calling for preparing an implementation plan, that the USGS is the lead, that it involves scientific state geological surveys, and it involved mechanisms for identifying short and long-term priorities for each of the 4 components. How is this addressed? Well, USGS is the lead agency. State geological surveys are in partnership with the USGS. The components are fully functioning, and these interdisciplinary studies, formerly called support component, continue to support federal mapping and moving forward. It also calls for a plan identifying the following things. This number 4 clause was removed, talking about archiving and using interferometry and other kinds of information. It also called for adopting scientific and technical map standards, as well as monitoring for inventory of published and current mapping investigations, and doing so nationwide. So how is this addressed? Even though that clause number 4 was removed, I think we can see that the USGS's 3DEP program and also the IFSAR used extensively in Alaska actually satisfies it, even though it's removed. We can see map standards development and mapping inventory is accommodated through the NGMDB, and as well as outside of the NGMDB. And one comment would be an annually updated status map of NGMDB and other map products produced by the USGS and other in states would be quite useful. And I think that is being recently called upon to do so. Section 7 is a standalone section for the National Geologic Map Database, saying that the survey shall establish this database, which will be the national archive that includes all maps developed pursuant to the Act, and that everything have a standardized format, symbols, and various technical attributes. 1997 reauthorization really emphasized that development of standards. Entities that contribute geologic map archives shall develop the standards. The 1999 reauthorization emphasized the function, that this should serve as a national catalog and archive, and then distributed through links to federal and state geologic map holdings. Sub A says specifically this applies to all maps developed under the federal component and the education component. Notice that the word state component is missing in the 1999 reauthorization. At that time, I can recall there being some pushback for states trying to figure out if putting their holdings in the federal government would hurt their holdings within their own organization. And it took until 2009 to change the language. So it now reads, all maps developed with funding provided by the NCGMP, including under the federal, state, and education components. So it now includes all program components. So how was Section 7 addressed? Well, it emphasizes the National Geologic Map Database as the National Map Archive. And I think all you have to do is note the number of places where it's mentioned in the Act. And this database ensures that all the submitted map products adhere to standards selected by the NCGMP program office. Section 8 is simply an annual report that the USGS submit an annual report to the Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs in the House of Representatives, How is this addressed? Each year, the NCGMP reports on Federal Advisory Committee activities through the annual comprehensive review and report. For FY 2021, we met on April 7th. There'll be a follow-up meeting scheduled late in the year. NCGMP will draft and submit a report from the Secretary through DOI. So that is accommodated quite well. Section 9 is authorization. This is the last section of the Act. And these were the exact numbers from 1992, and you can see the split between federal support, state, and educational component. The total authorization was $55 million. If we translate that to 2021 dollars, there's been 88% of inflation, and that comes out to about 104 million. So that's one heck of an authorization limit. And I think when we look at authorizations through time, I think we can see here what happened in 1992, where it's increasing to that 55 million mark. In 1997, it got reduced. In 1999, it got reinstated as being higher, but by 2005, it achieved its $64 million mark, and that has persisted through the 2009 and the 2019 reauthorizations. So in 1992, we know the law was passed. During implementation, the overhead rate was established at 18%. You can see the split out for federal support, state, and education, but initial appropriations were initially set at 21 million for FedMap, and that includes the support map at the time, 1.3 million for state map, and 0 for EdMap. And then by an agreement between the USGS and AASG, it established that state map would receive 20% of NCGMP's funds, and John Price mentioned this earlier. This is where state map funding and compilations increased to almost 4.5 million in FY96, and it's also where funding for EdMap commenced. If we look a little bit more in detail, what happened at these various reauthorizations, you can see the amounts here. They're also reflected on the table that I showed. But the one in 97 is the one that really emphasized NCGMP as a joint USGS AASG endeavor. In the 1999 one was interesting because it dictated that 48% of future funding above FY 2000 levels were allocated to state map and 2% to EdMap. 10 years later, that 48% went up to 50% above the FY 2005 level, went to state map, and 4% to EdMap. That's where the 4% came from. And in 2019, there really were just minor clerical adjustments, but it did extend the Act and the $64 million authorization to the year 2023. So what were the states doing at this time? And I can only reflect on my state because it's actually written up as a preamble to a particular ISGS publication. And as early as 1989, we were preparing for passage of significant federal legislation. And we actually formed a mapping advisory committee called IGMAC. And in 1991, a year before it was passed, the Illinois Senate passed a resolution recognizing, pending federal legislation with match requirements. And to justify the economic benefits of mapping, they asked us to, provide a report to them. And that was this ISGS Circular 549, where we looked at the benefits and costs of geological mapping for a couple of the counties in the state and then extrapolated that to the rest of the state. And an interesting note is that in the 1988, 1990, 89 area, OMB required a USGS benefit cost study. And I can recall them specifically saying that depending upon its outcome, NCGMP funding would either increase or decrease. And USGS Circular 1111, Societal Value of Geological Maps, that's that Loudoun County study, was that report. And if you recall that statement by Bob Fackendenny back in 1992, he said he was talking about the National Geological Mapping Act was very unique because it would improve the nation's wealth, health, and well-being at a positive benefit cost ratio. I don't think it's any coincidence that these benefit cost studies came out within months of passage of this act and had a lot to do with showing the benefits of geological mapping in real cost terms. This is just a shot of the publication that we did, Geological Mapping. for the future of Illinois. To the right is the prioritization that we did for the state. We prioritized every quadrangle in the state. You can see it, really emphasized around the Chicago area, Illinois River area, East St. Louis area. And much of this holds up as much today as it did in 1992. And just some final thoughts here, what were state geological surveys doing to address this National Geological Mapping Act? It's really almost a case of history repeating itself. In 1992, it was obviously that us, and I'm sure other states as well, anticipated this increased federal funding for geological mapping. There's a 10 or 15-year lead up to this. And then there was incredible need for match, and folks took action. A lot of action that was taken. And fast forward almost 30 years, states have received more federal funding for geological mapping, perhaps more on the horizon coming, and there's going to be more match requirements, and there's going to be more action needed. Thank you very much.
Okay, this